All
All
right.
right.
Want to lead off, Annalisa?
Yeah, so today, um, I know for some of the graduating students who are taking the exam today, um, so this is our like review session for the first half of the class, and then graduating students will take the exam for the second half of the class. And then, if anybody who's not a graduating student and is not taking the exam wants to hang out for the a little while after that second half of the class to ask questions, you're totally welcome to. But what we're gonna do today is we're gonna have for a little bit, Professor Clark's sister is speaking with the class. Um, so that'll be a really interesting discussion. And then after that, we're going to have a little bit of time for you guys to ask questions about the exam, about the class, about grading, about anything like that. So I can answer those questions before you take the exam. And then with whatever remaining time we have left in the session, I have a couple questions set up for Professor Clark that are sort of relating to the exam. So hopefully it'll get you guys going with some ideas for things to write about on the exam or questions to ask that'll help you in writing your exam. But yeah, so right now we're going to talk with Professor Clark's sister.
Well, she's not there now.
Yeah, I'm here.
Oh, okay, there she is. Perfect. I'm sorry. Okay, Kelsey, please lead off.
Well, I can't see anybody.
Can't
So
see anybody.
right. So everybody's just is anybody really there behind their dots? Right.
What do you say,
Yeah.
folks? Can you just turn on your screens unless you're unless you're only using a system which prohibits that? There we go. Here we go.
Hi. Hi. Well, I'm greeting you from Berkeley, California. And so my name's Kelsey, and my brother will show a photo. And so I understand that you all might be interested in how I visited the University of Chicago sit-in in late January, February 1969. So I'll just say a word of background, which is I started the U of C at age 17. I don't know, do they still have an early entrant program for people?
Less stressed.
Yeah, who hadn't started high school, who hadn't finished high school. So I was probably kind of politically naive, but I'd been on a lot of Vietnam protest marches in New York City. And so the summer of 1968 was the Democratic National Convention in Chicago, which was, as I'm sure you all know, was the scene of a lot of violence I believe, in Lincoln Park. So when I first arrived in the fall, there was like a 1 month anniversary peaceful protest march, but the tension with the Chicago police was just seething, and it was very different from what I'd ever experienced in New York City. Though, of course, those were Vietnam marches, and this was about the Democratic National Convention. Anyway, that gave me a little bit of an idea about how we at the UFC were in a different world from Chicago, the Chicago of Mayor Daley. And so fast forward to the sit-in, I can't say I really understood what the issues were about terribly well. It was the student. I mean, it was led by SDS contingent, Students for a Democratic Society. The specific issue was about the non-rehiring of a particular professor. So the whole thing it's kind of strange and difficult to compare in that sense to student protest movements now or other ones that have to do with world issues, because it had been chosen by the SDS leaders to focus on the non-rehiring of a particular professor who was a Marxist and a feminist woman Um, so I wasn't really that active in it, but I did visit the sit-in a couple of times. And then my mother happened to come and visit her son and daughter in Chicago. And my mother and I went to the building and walked around and I believe, is it called it's called Levi Hall now?
Yeah, Edward Levy. Yeah.
Yeah, but it wasn't, I mean, Edward Levy was the president then, so then it had a different name. So as my mother and I came out, there were a bunch of photographers there from the Chicago Sun-Times and other newspapers, I guess. So lo and behold, the next day, this photo of my mother and me appeared on the front page of the Chicago Sun-Times. And there was a journalist named Mike Royko, who was a daily columnist then. So I'm wearing this garment. We had just gone to Colombia, South America, over that Christmas to visit. Yeah. So anyway, it doesn't show the article itself, but so Mark Royko writes, Connecticut mother visits revolting daughter at University of Chicago. So, I mean, perhaps it was meant with some humor, but it was also kind of a scathing insult towards the types of people who went to the University of Chicago. And there was, I don't know if this has anything to do with it, as far as how there had been a long-standing conflict between the city and the university, because the U of C was seen as a pinko commie place. And my mother had on this very tall fur hat, which someone had brought her from Russia. So who knows? It might have even looked as though she was a Russian agent wearing her fur hat. And I'm wearing this garment that was from South America because we had just visited another sister who was in the Peace Corps there. And so, any questions?
Yeah, what do you do now? Like, what did you study, and then what did you get into after school?
Right. So, all right, I think we're done with the photo.
Okay. I'll try to figure that out.
Okay. So I'm sorry, I didn't see your name. Who just
It's Kaya.
Kaya. Hi, Kaya. Right. So you asked who I am now and what did I do with my education?
Yeah.
So yeah. So I well, I didn't get kicked out, which was important, though I did get called before the disciplinary committee, which was one of the most terrifying experiences of my life. And I had been advised to just downplay everything very much. So I said, well, my mother and I were just sort of looking around. And I can remember Professor Josh Weintraub, who was later, I loved him as a Western Civ professor. He said, he had, in his Austrian accent, he said, so you were there as tourists? And anyway, it was, and did you know that you were breaking the law? But I think anyway, so I didn't, there were 19 students who did get expelled, who were the actual leaders out of over 400 who were in the sit-in. And well, I started out in an I love the Common Core, and there was an interdisciplinary program that was starting right then called the New Collegiate Division that was headed by Jamie Redfield. So I started out in history and philosophy of religion. And then I took a year out between my third and fourth year. And when I came back, my professor with whom I did tutorials was just in the divinity school. He wasn't in that anymore. And I figured I might be going to graduate school, or probably would later, in anthropology. So I switched my major to anthropology. And so I probably graduated with the fewest actual courses in anthropology that anybody ever had. Yeah, so then I I went to India that next year, and that same professor at my graduation said, "Why would you do that?" And I said, "Well, I'm going to go to graduate school in anthropology in a few years, and then I'm going to be wearing the blinders of my whatever my research project is. And so I want to go with an open mind, and when I'm 21 years old." So anyway, that was a very important time, and then did some other searching for a few years, and then I did go to graduate school at UC Berkeley, and I did do my field work in India and the United States, and I've lived in Berkeley ever since. So so my career as an anthropologist was some of the time in academia, and some of the time writing grants and doing a kind of freelance work. And so, but it was very difficult to exist outside of academia. So a number of years ago, about 15 years ago, I decided to go back to graduate school and become a psychologist. And so now I have a private practice as a psychotherapist. And on my website and my blurb, I say, and I hope this is true, as a therapist who is also a cultural anthropologist, I bring a special lens. And so I do very much try to work with people in understanding the cultural, social, gender, historical context of their lives. And I enjoy collaborating with my brother, talking about sociological and anthropological and sometimes political topics. So thanks for asking, Kaya.
That's super interesting. Like, that's such a faceted career. Like, I feel like I'm probably gonna I think I'm probably gonna take like a very similar path of like jumping around from thing to thing. So I feel like there's a lot that overlaps and like can be applied in other areas.
Mm-hmm. Oh, that's good. That's good to hear. I know that I mean there's so much career pressure now that it seems that very few graduating people feel that they can take time to explore or do different things. And so you can. Yeah, right. So are you guys what, Tara?
Well, let me just add briefly that our mother was the president of her tennis team, and then president of her college class at Bryn Mawr. And after she graduated, she worked for the International ILGWU, the International Lady Garment Workers, which was the most close to Marxist activism in the U.S. in New York. And she lived in Greenwich Village, and then she worked with mostly Russian immigrant ladies, and she would try to organize them to sing the international. But before doing that, she'd sing Gilbert and Sullivan songs, which she would, and so she'd sing all of these. She would sing to us as we were growing up. Okay, and so the hat and she okay, I won't say more about that. The hat, it could have been Russian, it could have been whatever else, but it was not simply a if you will, the normal implication of a Royco label, which was the opposite of of what she in fact did not appear in what would be on the front page. She did not see me. She came here only for a day. She was in and out and back to Connecticut, and I didn't know that this was happening at all. So I was walking back to my apartment, and as I looked down on the floor, I passed a couple of other built units in my high-rise apartment, and there was the front page of the Sun-Times. I said, "Oh my God, what's my sister?" And this looks familiar. Okay, so anyway, I was a little shocked, and and we've discussed it ever since.
Yeah, yeah.
But any other comparisons with the current situation that anyone wants to raise with?
I had a question. I know that you said that it's kind of hard to compare the current situation with what was happening.
Could you show us our faces? This is our teaching assistant as well. This is Annalisa Hinkle.
Hi.
Right.
Oh, hi, Annalisa. Hi.
Hi. Yeah, so I know you said that it's kind of hard to compare the situation that was going on back then and what is happening now with student protests, but I guess I was wondering like how your experience participating in student protests back then has shaped your viewpoint on what's going on with student protests right now. Like how do you view them? How do you view their effectiveness? How do you view student participation in them? I was just wondering like your perspective on it.
Sure. Yeah. Well, I suppose having been in Berkeley ever since, where it's sort of the norm, in a way, they're it's a funny thing to say. I don't even think about it because it's so much the norm. And I guess I was referring a bit back about the town and gown. And because I was reading about, I was trying to see if there was if what I perceived as some differences between Berkeley and Chicago as cities and in relation to their student movements back then compared to now, if that would be more similar or more different now. So the summer of 1969, I happened to come to Berkeley for a month, and I was on campus, not participating in a student protest. I can't remember what it was about, but I was just wandering around on the campus, and all of a sudden the Berkeley police just like came after all whatever the protest was in Sproul Plaza, and I ran away being tear gassed to smithereens and just like was running for my life. So it gave me a very negative view towards the Berkeley police, and which was sort of funny because when I've been in that peaceful anti-Vietnam march in Chicago, I mean, that was the first time I ever heard police called pigs, and the standoff between the protesters and the police was so violent. So part of the sense, even though there was tremendous tension at the U of C, part of the sense that we were all part of the same academic institution was that the University of Chicago didn't call in the Chicago police. Now, I don't remember anything about campus police, so I was looking, so tell me if I'm understanding this correctly. I was just looking at what was happening there on your campus a week ago today. And so that when the police went in and they tore down the encampment, but those were U of C police, right? Yeah. So and then I think there was so anyway, the point of that being that I think living my adult life in Berkeley, the ethos of the university and of the city is so progressive in general that there's, even though I got tear gassed by the Berkeley police in 1969, there's more of a sense here that whenever there's anything to protest, one protests. And which sounds sort of simplistic, but it doesn't mean, however, that people are necessarily comfortable or better at dealing with conflict. And I think, yeah. So I'm not, so keep asking. I'm not quite sure if that's getting at your questions, Annalise.
No, I think it is. I'm just wondering because like I think you did a good job answering the question. I just wonder how people from like different generations who have experienced different sorts of student protests are like feeling about the current state of like, you know, what it kind of looks like now. But yeah, I think you did a good job of answering the question. So thank you.
Right. Well, this isn't exactly about a student protest, but in this class, you talk, I mean, you talk about scenes a lot. So do you talk about art in this course?
Yes, and yes, indeed.
Okay. Well, so this seems to be a very Berkeley thing, but it could be anywhere. So the other thing I've done in my life too, Akaya, is I've studied modern dance since high school. The older kids all played basketball and other sports, and I couldn't compete with them. So I've been studying modern dance with my same dance teacher for 40 years, since 1984. So she has a small troupe here, and they were giving a performance last week. And so different performers were performing. So my dance teacher was she's not a Zionist by any means, but she's Jewish. Her family was lost in the Holocaust. She's, just tremendously identified with her Jewish heritage as well as present. And so to her, the Israeli hostages are still very foremost, or very much in her mind. So at this dance performance that was coming up, one of the dancers had choreographed a piece called Lament. And she had choreographed this about 2 years ago, where she was lamenting climate change and the damage that we're doing to the planet. And now she revamped the dance, a solo, and wanted to dedicate it to the children of Gaza. And she had a paragraph about that. So interestingly, Ruth, my dance teacher, felt that she couldn't read the blurb, and that it was just that there would be too many people in the audience with conflicting views on one side or the other side, and that it would be too polarizing. It would be too upsetting for some people, and that to have a dance that's only pro-Palestinian would be too polarizing in that type of a setting. So she asked my advice, and so I took some advice that's indirectly from my brother and from a very important person named Lorna Ferguson, who's taught me a lot about negotiation. And I said, it's helpful in a tense situation like that if you add something rather than just critique it or take it away. So I suggested, how about if she couldn't read the thing, but she asked the other dancer to say that this memorializes the children of Gaza, and also victims of violence and terrorism in anywhere. And so the dancer added that, and I don't think anyone was, it was unduly upset, and she did her dance in a black dress, and anyone could lament whatever they wanted to lament. But so I just thought it was a kind of a poignant microcosm of the kinds of more macro conflicts. And I guess just intellectually and in terms of international relations, trying to compare the level of demand that the students had in the 1969 sit-in. It seems, that was one of the kinds of changes that has eventually come about, because the demand was to ask that students would be able to have some role of participating in the decision-making of the hiring and firing of faculty. And that is something that has changed over the last 50 years. So
we have Jingyi Ma has her hand raised, and she, I will add, was one of the 3 presidents of all of the universities in Shanghai, and she's a very sophisticated participant, observer, activist in China, and I'm sure has many thoughts. So Jingyi, please lead on with comments or questions.
Yeah. Thank you, Professor, and thank you for your sharing. I have a question about the how the California's public school system can affect the social movement. Before I have see a research about the bargaining with bankers in the UCB, which means the social movement happened in UCB and increased taxes on the millionaires in the whole California. And one insight of that is because the California's public schools can create the civic leaders, and this network based on shared identity and social ties will have a very tight emotional community. So however, the University of Chicago is a private university. So I wonder, you have attended the 2 social movement before, in both universities. So my first question is that what do you think the public university school, this system will have some, will have some influences on such student social movement? Yeah, because I have the question is because, in China, almost all universities are public, and they have the networks and the connections, but and they also have the shared identity or the shared emotion, but they they hardly have some collective actions. Yeah, and my second question is about the campaign in UChicago. I mean, I believe the camps in the campus, they generated a scene that will not only leak the like the comforts and the consumerism, which the young people like, but also it also provided a visible network that the students will connection with each other. So I want to ask that before, like several like a decade years ago, is that also happened in like UCB or UChicago to use these things to have the student social movement? Yeah, thank you.
Oh, those are really important questions, Ying Ma. And I don't know enough about them really to be able to answer in any significant way about the networks. I think that there's something problematic in the public school nature of the University of California, in that a lot of the policies and decisions have to be approved by the regents of the University of California, so that the administrators and faculty are, with regard, they're often in quite a bind. Like the chancellor of UCB, who's retiring right now, Carol Christ, she has had to walk a very tight rope, because she, like at any private university, she makes the point that student right to free speech is, I mean, that university, UCB is the home of the free speech movement, and that's a hallmark, certainly. But as other university administrators all say, but that violence or impinging on the right of students is not to learn isn't all right. But I think so as far as the social identity, I think there's so many social identities, and that here at UCB and at the public institutions, that even though there might be more of an ethos of student protest and more of a history at UCB anyway, I don't think there's the same kind of coherence as a university as a private university like the University of Chicago has. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I get it. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah. So
let me just add as well that Kelsey has had a daughter who has grown up in Berkeley and has gone to, elementary school, high school. Then she went to Harvard for college, and then got a PhD at Stanford, and then was continually very close to Kelsey, talking about growing up and reacting against these surroundings. And as well, and she, the daughter, her specialty has been the relations between Russian and Ukraine. And she's published on this for several years. So these are not delicate issues which have been ignored in this family for 3 generations, as you can hear among these activist women.
Right. Yeah. But I feel, thank you, Terry, but I feel like I'm not answering Ying's question very, very well, probably because I'm not familiar enough now with I'm trying to rack my brain about the
sorry to intervene, but let me just give one quick example, which Kelsey referred to, the regents. That's a major point. The regents, I don't know if are they elected by the citizens of California?
No, I think they're appointed by the governor. Yeah.
Okay, but they're appointed by the governor. The point is, this is directly part of the public state of California.
Yeah.
These are not
Yeah.
These are not private. They're not academics at all. They're politicians often.
Right. Yes.
And
Yes.
that's
Right.
very different. That's very different from the USC. And one example, Joseph Yee, who with whom I've organized a course, he went to college. He was a Berkeley student, undergraduate, and while he was an undergraduate, there was a referendum for the citizens of the state of California, and they voted to abolish affirmative action in the state of California, specifically including the University of California, and they did. So in that next year, when he was there, the proportion of African American students dropped by half, and the proportion of Asian American students doubled. And so he felt terribly guilty, as he was a Korean American in background, and he's really spent his career trying to understand and find ways to overcome. And his book is called God and Karate on the South Side, was how God and karate and evangelical religion have been solutions, if you will, consciously and self-consciously selected by young African-American men, which embraced certain aspects of sort of Horatio Alger's self-discipline, using religion and martial arts in order not to be part of your family, not to be part of not knowing who your father is, but you find these values in ways that work out in ways through kinds of terms. Kelsey's important point. They are involved in 4 kinds of institutions, from religion to martial arts to selling things as a third kind of activity, and then fourth, a Soko Gakkai is a Japanese funded religious activity showing the interpenetration of these huge potentially conflicting values, but they're often distilled, leading to alternatives that are closer to more middle-class American values, not gangs, not crime, and yet but then very explicitly, ethnographically interviewing these kinds of people, as well as having a chapter on social surveys of this. So I'm simply pointing out that if you want that kind of detail, one can find that among minorities within the U.S. and who have flipped around in terms of how they've been being treated at Berkeley and then at Chicago at the USC. So just there's a lot of material written about this, not to mention Seymour Martin Lipset, etc. Okay, but any last question or two briefly, and then we should push on to other things. But Kelsey's been great.
Hi, Kelsey. This is
Hi.
and I thought I have a question maybe you mentioned before, but I just want to clarify it. It's like, as we know, like recent protest, comparing to the previous thing, is like they engage more, or the virtual world or the social media are have more engagement to the protest. Like, because I follow something from the Instagram, I found they had pages and their accounts, like, publish so many newest information about their protest. So I was curious, like, okay, in your opinion, comparing with your experiences in the past, like how the internet or the social media maybe changed something for the social protest, like, maybe I just assume like engaging more people in that process.
Oh,
or
yeah.
Are there any differences or changes to nowadays process with the help, or in some way I thought it's help, like, building some things in the internet or some decline or something about that?
Oh, I mean, in 1969, I mean, there were no cell phones, there was no internet, so you wouldn't text your friend. I mean, you wouldn't text your friend and say, I'll meet you at the protest in 20 minutes. And yeah, none of that existed. So now whether that would have any bearing on Yingying's question about comparing public and private universities, I don't know. That I would think would be a more global societal change over this historical period that would allow for any kind of interaction, information, and networking. Wouldn't you think?
Yeah, thank you. I was just thinking about that because I thought, I don't know, I was like, I just thinking like maybe somebody in the past, they're maybe because some limitations, they're afraid of engaging in the protest physically. I was thinking that probably the internet provide them a new way or method to engage in the protest, and I don't know, probably like change of the combination of the protest group or something. Yeah, I was just thinking about that. But
Yeah.
thanks for answering.
Rusi, do you think that would add to the motivation and ability to participate or take away from it? Because on the one hand, there's a lot more possibility for communicating. On the other hand, there's a lot more visibility, so you might not want to be seen.
Yeah.
A potential student protester could, if you could show up in so many places, and so if you post yourself on Instagram and then next year you're applying for a job, you have to delete all of that from your account or whatever. So what do you think would be the relative, not pros and cons, but relative influences in this direction and that direction?
I don't know. I thought what you said is really true. Like, for me, I think because of the internet, like my families, my relatives in China, they get the news really fast. And so many people, friends or families of me in China just call me I think last month or a few weeks before, and to tell me like, don't be engaged in the protest. You need to protect yourself because you are an international student. Yeah, I was thinking like, I don't know, but I thought in some way like, the internet or the social media just provide us, like we said, like we learned about the theory of things. It's like it just built an area like to attract people, or like people with similar thoughts and feelings or similar willings of God into a place, and like do something for that. But also in another way, like you said, like internet, we have a world like internet have memories, like they can record.
Yeah, right.
What we have said, what we have do, and to somebody it's like they have to think twice before they really take the action.
Right.
Yeah, but I don't know, like just for me, for my understanding, I was thinking like, to somebody who wanted to be engaged in the protest, I don't think that social media will affect their behavior or thought. I think the influence is more on the people who are like a little hesitated about, okay, whether I should engage or not. And like they will have different, like you said, something like pros and cons to different people, but like, yeah, I think that's my thoughts about it.
Right. Well, and one other thing, this is not so much about the internet, but about media representation in general. I think the vast amount of media coverage does tend to oversimplify and adds to oversimplify the issues, and then I think that tends to add to the polarization, and a kind of a dumbing down of what the issues are. So that's a whole other thing with the, yeah, right.
Let me mention one last thing about your impact on at least your own family, Kelsey, and then we should push on to other things. That your own daughter, among other things, was teaching a course at Stanford briefly on President Putin in Russia, and now she's no longer doing those kinds of things, but she did in the past, just to give you a flavor of and Stanford is a pretty top political science department, so to have that involved, and that involvement shows you where you can move from Berkeley to Chicago to wherever else, Kiev and Moscow, where she spent time growing up and honing her answers to these kinds of questions, and they get more and more subtle and sophisticated if you read what she said. So thank you, folks. Thank you, Kelsey, for enlightening us with these, not going beyond the simple numbers and the headlines, but the way people feel and emotionally react and have families trying to help them. Or these are all part of the many different roles in our own heads and bodies, which push us in different angles and activities. So,
well, thank you, and I've really enjoyed the participation of Kaya and Annalise and Ying Ying and Rusi, and seeing the China angle here. It's interesting what I'm going to go do now at 2:30. I have a little sort of a subcategory of my work where I help graduate students who are writing their dissertations, and not so much on the content, but on how to get the job done. So one of my students who was at UCB in political science has been at a small East Coast college, and she didn't get a tenure track job there because she's a Japan and international relations specialist. And even though she's helping 3 students write their senior theses about China, the small college has switched the definition of the tenure track job, which she was hoping that she would be qualified for, from an East Asia specialist to a China specialist. So she's very sad, but she's no longer qualified because they're going to get a China specialist. And so she's, in this last year, she tried to broaden her horizons enough, but it was interesting because she's at a small college in central Maine, and that all of these international relations and East Asian politics are important, even in small towns and small colleges in Maine. So I wanted to pass that on, but also with appreciation to the international participation that you have in this seminar right here. So yeah, so thank you very much, and have a good rest of your class.
thank you, Kelsey. Okay.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
All right. Any things that anyone wants to ask, and or Annalisa, you can intervene whenever you want.
Yeah, just anybody, like, first off, just any questions about the exam, anything that anybody wants clarification on in terms of either the structure of the exam or the content of the exam?
Yeah, can I ask a question really quick? So you said that the seniors are taking it today in the last house. So is it just the hour and like hour and a half for class
Yeah.
as well?
Yeah, it'll just be, so it'll actually, that's for everybody. Everybody is just gonna have the 80 minutes timed. So it'll be the exact same for the seniors, and it'll be the exact same for everybody who's taking the exam next week as well. I know in a previous class we had said that the time would be, you know, extended for the to fit the final exam period, but it's not, it's just the 80 minutes. So we're just gonna grade you based off of what you can produce in those 80 minutes.
Okay, perfect.
Yeah, Ryan?
The exam isn't listed on the registrar, and I assume it's online again, but does that mean the timing is just gonna be like remote via the timing that you sent out in that announcement?
So, are you're a graduating student or no?
No,
Okay.
third year.
Yeah, so our exam time, because we're a 3-hour period, it's not going to be listed as like the exact exam time on the registrar's website, but we're going based off of the 3:30 spot on Tuesdays. So that should be the Friday of exam week, I believe, at 12:30. Let me check really, really quickly, just to make sure that we have the time right on this recording. But it will be the Friday of exam week.
Okay,
And
I'm just asking because I looked at the list by class and I didn't see our class listed on there.
yeah, look, so if you here, I can't share this with the class, but it'll be, so it's gonna be the 3:30 to 4:50 Tuesday, Thursday class time slot. And so it'll be Friday starting at 12:30 p.m. And then it'll be an 80-minute timed exam. So 3:30 on the Friday, or 12:30 on the Friday of exam week. Okay.
Okay, got it. And it's the same format as the midterm where you just email out the exam and we just email it back.
Yeah, everything will be exactly the same,
Okay.
minus the content, which will obviously be different, but it'll be the exact same structure, exam format, and the exact same way we send it out to you and you send it right back to us.
Okay, got it. Thank you.
Awesome. Yeah. Anybody else?
Yeah, I think I have two questions for clarification. And the first one is like, I saw you maybe mentioned before, like, maybe decline, maybe remove the extension time. I just want to clarify, so for the international students, we still have maybe 20 minutes to more to answer, or
Yeah, so non-native English speakers have an extra 20 minutes, and then just make sure to mark that at the top of your exam so that we know, the reason why you would have sent it in past the exam time. So if you're not a native English speaker, it's 20 more minutes for your exam.
okay, got you. And another question is about the thesis, like, because I just finished the thesis with SEMA, and I don't think I find the deadline of handing in the thesis to you. So I just want to make sure, like, it's today or same as like,
The final paper,
yeah, the final paper.
yeah, you can hand that in pretty much any time before. I really would prefer it anytime before Friday at 5 p.m. because that's the same as the participation deadline. But if it's done now, you can feel free to turn it in now.
Okay, got you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Awesome. Okay. Does anybody else have any questions about the exam?
Oh yeah, I have a question about the participation document. If a student participate in class in person, should we also hand out the participation document? Oh yeah.
Everybody who's participated in class, I've marked you guys down as your participation grade because I know who's been in class and who hasn't. If you have anything that you want to submit, you can feel free to submit it, but we're not expecting anybody who's shown up to class, like, consistently to submit extra participation materials.
But
Okay.
it only helps your grade to submit more. You can't lower your grade. You only raise it. So show us more, such as working on a draft for a paper or whatever else is fine.
Yeah. All right. So if nobody else has any questions, if anything comes up, you can feel free to stop us through the next we have like 20 minutes ish. I just wanted to kind of go over with Professor Clark, do a little like small Q&A just about some stuff that may or may not like be helpful on the exam. So just to kind of wrap up our class, I wanted to ask Professor Clark one very specific question that may or may not be helpful on the exam. So Professor Clark, what do you think is the role of art, performance art, music, digital art, street art, that sort of thing, any sort of art in urban innovation, urban development?
That's practically the main content of the whole course. As I've said before, I didn't teach these topics concerning the arts and more generally aesthetics until about 15 years ago when we were reanalyzing what Robert Putnam wrote about in Bowling Alone, and we looked before more at political parties, at social movements, at income and education of the citizens, the background of the council and the mayor and so forth. And then we found a doubling in the civic activities of American citizens nationally at all age groups on average, not that it's equally everywhere, but the national representative sample of Americans has doubled in membership and participation in social and cultural and artistic groups, along with education related to them. And that in turn led us to look for things like this when we discovered it and said, as this was such a contradiction and there's virtually nothing written about this. And still, there is very little written by social scientists or people in finance or in economics, but it is gradually being recognized. It has always been written about by historians of art or art gallery dealers or by painters and activists themselves. And they'd like to think that they're important, but the point is this has drastically changed. and part of that is because the artists themselves are writing about, painting about, discussing social and ideological and political issues in their art themselves, in their poetry, in their drama. And so in that sense, we have this overlap of a much greater degree, such that I even went to a session where a professor, she's an artist, and she teaches also at the Art Institute of Chicago, but she also works on a park and renovating and transforming a park in Gary, where she lives, which is a predominantly African-American city, just by Chicago. But she herself was white, and yet they found a huge amount of support and interest in what she was doing because she made this ugly park into a beautiful, attractive location that was not specifically race related at all. It was just a beautiful park. Okay, so in that sense, Theaster Gates, whose work we've read clearly would articulate something like this of talking about aesthetics, art, attractiveness at the same time. But he came to us precisely because he didn't have a program. And so he was questioned again and again. And so now we had 4 students who did MAs that explored these kinds of issues. And he now has a clear program, which we've linked within the course at the beginning. And most of all, the subtle, ironic, humorous version is what he has put on videos on YouTube and the like, that you can see what he's doing, such as rollerblading around with 4 or 5 other sort of rather active, athletic, engaged African Americans in the middle of a museum, which was I think it was in Washington, D.C., where people were not prompted or told about this being happening, but they were surrounded by people on roller skates in the middle of a museum as they were looking at the paintings, etc. So just kind of example of what he might do. In terms of more generally, I would say I went to art school for a bit in Paris and New York, and I decided I didn't have the artistic talent to continue, and so I gave up being a real artist. But I would say the takeaway is not that I'm any good in doing it that well, but I had a sense of eye of looking at things and seeing how they appear as an artist might or a photographer might, as well as someone who might be, say, a movie director who might think about how to make it more attractive. So one thing I've said in terms of scenes and policy for mayors and for public officials is not to think about what you're doing in terms of activities in government policy, such as calling the police, but to don't think of yourself as a military leader. Think of yourself as a movie director, a film director. And in that sense, you've got all different kinds of resources at your disposal, but think of where and how people will see the consequences of having the police come in and beating up students. And then that I'll just add in terms of the brief references to the past. The University of Chicago was the only institution that handled that as it did in 1968, 69. There were lots of, most universities, all the major universities had demonstrations, Berkeley, Harvard, and so forth. They called in the police, and that drove the students, and as Kelsey described as a student herself, and I would also stress the teaching assistants and the faculty were alienated by the heavy-handed administrative perception, which was generated by simply calling the police, rather than letting them. That is, I'll just add, at the USC, after a month, the students voluntarily just got tired of being there and didn't stay there anymore. But then after that, as you heard with Kelsey, each individual was brought before a board to see what did you do and what were your feelings about it. And she was not an activist, and as you saw, she was not punished. But in that sense, that transformed it, as Edward Levy, who was later on the Attorney General of the United States, you could see a different way of thinking of an individual motivation rather than collectively acting as an institution against another institution, as it was seen as police versus the protesting students. Okay, but I would say the more important point is as we have as well social media, we have discussions of aesthetics, we have the presence of art, aesthetics, emotion, that the arts can explicitly engage the emotions in ways that this is directly possible to try, at least tries, in ways that political leaders for instance, students who've worked with me on Caribbean national government officials would try to get the artists, the dancers, the Caribbean singers who were probably the highest status people in many of those islands to endorse the ironically seen as corrupt, irresponsible political leaders in the Caribbean. And so you have the political leaders giving money to the artists to try to endorse them. And the woman who wrote her BA doing this was the daughter of a political leader doing that. So she had a good sense of how this was happening in ways that you don't normally read about in the general media. So these are, and so in terms of, for instance, cultural policy, or the way that the different political and civic and other kinds of media officials, with Trump using, instead of using massive amounts of money for spending and advertisements, as Hillary Clinton did, and most other previous political candidates did, he used these little bits of tea, now called Twitter tweets, in ways that led to a massive kind of mobilization, in ways that were dramatically shocking, in ways that we now have this all going on simultaneously. And so my solution in the course is to try not to say one is right or wrong or whatever, but life is now an interpenetration of many, many things going on simultaneously. We occupy different roles. We have different jobs. We have different fun activities, different kinds of dance, and so forth. And all of these things flow together in ways that you, not just in your own, in any one course, but our lives now have this kind of interpenetration, which we can then read about in network analysis, or social space, or status set conflicts. I mean, we have literatures and subliteratures which try to measure and add the subtlety to, previously these may have been handled in a Faulknerian, Dickensian kind of novel or poem, or free association in the mind, that came in as around 1900 with Faulkner, with James Joyce, and Ulysses, and the like. T.S. Eliot wrote explicitly about essays about these issues. And now this is social science, not just the artists. Further questions, question, elaborations on any of that which I've just said, or anything else?
Yeah, if anybody has anything. If nobody has anything, then I have a follow-up question. Okay, so another thing that I wanted to maybe think about, like in terms of an example of how arts can influence the city and the urban environment, would be like, take for example a festival like in Chicago, Lollapalooza, something like that. I was wondering how, Professor Clark, how you see that having sort of an economic, a social, a cultural influence on a city like Chicago.
Yeah, Dan Silver and I did an editorial op-ed piece in the Sun-Times, the most widely read newspaper. We both got 10-minute phone calls from Rahm Emanuel, who was then the mayor, complimenting us on saying what we had said, and we briefly summarized a book called Scenescapes. He said he was really trying to do that, and he wanted to get copies of the book to show his staff, because they really want to do this more actively. And as I pointed out, if you knock on City Hall from Daley 2 through Rahm Emanuel, who did even more of this, the number one business of the economic base of the economy of Chicago was arts and tourism and culture, and the like. And so conventions had long been the case, but the conventions had not been explicitly linked with the arts and with museums, with restaurants, yes, but having restaurants including singing, dancing, whatever, with the restaurants and with the activities, which say one person might come for a 2-day conference and then he would go home, and he or she would now bring the family with kids, and they would all go to restaurants, or they would go to zoos, or they would go to, and this kind of business impact on restaurants, hotels, rental cars, all of this stuff, taxis, Ubers, all these things they've tried to measure and shown that this is that we're getting a little bit more like Greece and Italy and Spain, and which have been there for hundred or it's couple of hundred years. And so they have sections. You can get a PhD in economics and tourism, a PhD in sociology and tourism in Italy, for instance, and they have a ministry of tourism that is actively doing things. I was in Greece at an island right off the coast of Turkey, discussing this for several days while the guns were shooting. there was ammunition being fired. The war was not going on, but there were guns firing at each other at least the noises were being made. So in that sense, we have an interpenetration of even war and tourism and culture and aesthetic reactions are all going on simultaneously. So in terms of examples of, say, Lollapalooza specifically, this is the largest single summer semi-week-long bit of the summer devoted to many, many different kinds of activities. That's another illustration of my point, that we have, instead of a compromise, not choosing one kind of theme, which was the lowest common denominator, choosing people who are often an extreme version of Black power or feminism or gay this or and then over 100 types of specific music and types of music then may or may not, sometimes it may be linked. Some often start with that, with a social background. But one big point here is that the aesthetic choice of a particular type of music is a legitimate, salient, and increasingly important way of defining people's identities. So the Ray School is a grammar school right here in Hyde Park, just north of where the business school is practically. The Ray School had one student studied this for a BA, and she studied which groups form on the playground over lunchtime and which groups of students talk to each other in this city where the politics has classically been ethnic differences, neighborhood battles among aldermen, and 50 aldermen basing this often on ethnicity. And the answer was they had virtually none, that the informal students did that they created designs or designers. So you would have a Levi-Strauss crowd, a Gap crowd, a Bloomingdale's crowd, a Calvin Klein crowd, and they use these garments, designs or whatever, that were usually not too expensive, but which were distinctive enough that you didn't necessarily have to wear those kinds of clothes, but you could at least not use something which is said, I'm Polish and you're Jewish and we can't talk the way Kelsey talked, and the way that is, this is now which the U.S. House of Representatives are holding hearings on these kinds of issues, because the Ray School kids worked this out 20 years ago. Okay. On the other hand, how much self-selection is there? And obviously quite a bit, although the majority are not, I think, at least at that time, the majority of the students were not children of faculty. There were a few, but they were mostly residents of Chicago. And as you know, students as of maybe several years ago, no longer must you go to your neighborhood school, that you could potentially apply as a citizen and a student in the public schools of Chicago. You can apply to go to the Ray School even if you live at the complete far north or south, not at all within Hyde Park. So those are some of the educational, the occupational, the income, the drivers, but I would say as well, not only the narrow, if you will, materialist drivers underneath those. I'm not denying them, and that people took the title of our book, The City is an Entertainment Machine, in those terms. But I would stress as well that many people, especially in my Bronzeville neighbors, will take a particular type of music or a type of aesthetic, which they then elaborate, and even the gangs or young people as an individual post their own personal YouTube or other web locations where they post things, videos about themselves, and they can be about violence or the symbolism of violence. But Forrest Stewart, who was he and I used to bike around the city. He's published a book called "The Ballad of the Bullet," where the YouTube rating of the tough young African American men are fighting over YouTube ratings, showing that they are tougher than the other guys because they have a stronger rating on YouTube, rather than not actually being they're not really shooters, they're really directors of and actors of video and artistic activity. So showing these wide ranges of social and political activity, and this was or is the main job of some of these folks. Many are not working for a paid for salary, and the classically the underemployed, the unemployed, whatever numbers which are officially registered, but the proportion of young men in Bronzeville in the last 40 years, whatever, has been, maybe three times as high as the rest of the country. So if it's 10%, it'd be 30-40% maybe unemployed or underemployed in Bronzeville. But they may be collecting money or doing other ways of getting cash or getting something in the way that is not cash at all, but it may be something very indirectly about toughness, honor. And honor, of course, is a major used, both a label of not only feeling honored, but also dissed. If you are dissed, you've got to respond and diss more against that person who dissed you. And so that's the background of classic tribal battles, which go back thousands of years.
All right.
Other thoughts?
Yeah, I think that's a good place to stop for now, just because I want to give the seniors like 10 minutes or so to kind of sit and just take a little break before they take their exam. So yeah, any graduating students who know that they're going to take the exam at 5 p.m., feel free to go, take a little break. And if anybody else has anything that they want to discuss with us or any questions they want to ask, we're going to stay on the Zoom for a little bit longer. So yeah, but anyway, you're all going to do great on your exam, I'm sure, because you guys all did great on the midterm. So yeah, congrats to the graduating students and everybody else. I hope you have a really good summer, and I'm excited to read your exams. Thank you, guys.
Thank you. Oh, thank you.
Thank you. Oh, yeah, Professor, I have a question about, okay.
That's
Hello?
fine. Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, yeah. Well, Lucy and I have draft thesis on the social break, and we have done almost I mean the thesis of like the literature review and the background and the methodology, but we're not quite sure about the methodology because I used the special DID to like to divide the place, and also use like the PRQGs and ArcGs. So we want to know, like, do you have we will go to like a peak hall tomorrow for in-person class, so maybe we can attend the class. I mean, we can meet you after the class in person to discuss the methodology part.
Okay, now I would say the methodology or the specific data should link with and ideally test hypotheses. And so you should not just have these separate sections of the paper, they should join together. And there's no one type of hypothesis or no one type of methodology. As you know, there are many, many types of hypotheses and data and methods, but I would say the key thing is to try to find things that connect well. And they're one classic label that's used in all of the sciences is the idea of a crucial or critical experiment. So we usually don't do experiments in social life. We have actual behaviors and activities in people's lives, but their data and how you choose to find a particular type of activity, such as to try to capture the political culture of a neighborhood. One first student was Richard Lloyd, is published as a book, USC Press, called Neo-Bohemia. And then 10 years or so later, Jeff Parker did a PhD on the same neighborhood, comparing it to, as well, Bridgeport, which is the political leadership neighborhood. And a third to Bronzeville, I think it was Bronzeville, was the third neighborhood. But one of his methodologies to capture, how do you capture Bohemia? That's a much more subtle, aesthetic, closed style outlook. And he did several things, but one he did, which was creative, was to interview the shopkeepers and owners of those little shops that were selling books or coffee or clothes or records and magazines, books. And in that way, he interviewed those people and said, well, it's become too expensive and many artists have had to leave the neighborhood. They don't live here anymore. How do you maintain your image? So here's a variable. The scene imagery of Wicker Park is bohemian artistic. How can you create and maintain that when the artists have left? So the Richard Florida hypothesis that artists create Bohemia and that draws the crowd is wrong in the sense that the artists have left. And so the answers were the shopkeepers themselves are very important drivers without artists. But one way they handle it is also then once a month on Saturday night, you could have, they do have artists and art galleries, little shops that are open late at night, maybe till midnight. So you have many people who come from the suburbs, from the rest of Chicago, from other cities, and they come to this one arts neighborhood and they buy and sell paintings, pottery, sculpture, videos, poetry, books, which they have, and the artist is right there. So if you want to talk to the artist, you get a sense of, now I know, what she was trying to say in this painting, and I want to buy it, and I want it to be in my living room. And so they do. So there are ways like this that the arts can be both a cause and a consequence and a maintaining symbol of how the arts are important. And the methodology could be different specific types, but that is, I would say, part of the critical experiment. The smart idea was to interview the shopkeepers.
I see.
Yeah, sorry, I just want to add something for clarification. So, because I thought your question is more focused on, like qualitative methods, like maybe like something like the Bohemia, probably interviews could be a best way for us to represent the result. And in our study, we try to measure the.
I'm gonna turn off the recording, then turn it back on. So I'll try to do that. If I get disconnected, let's just call back. But let me try to